9 experienced hikers set up their tent on an exposed mountain slope in the northern Ural Mountains. It's February 1st, 1959. They have food, equipment, warm clothes, and a stove packed with firewood ready for morning. By the next day, all of them will be dead. When searchers found their tent 3 weeks later, it had been cut open from the inside. The group's boots, coats, and food were still inside. Footprints in the snow showed the group had walked, not run, downhill into minus 30-degree darkness in their socks. Some were found frozen at the edge of a forest. Others were found months later, buried under 4 meters of snow, with injuries the lead investigator described as consistent with a car crash or a pressure wave from an explosion. No weapon was found, no attacker, no clear explanation. The Soviet authorities closed the case in 1959. The file was classified. The official conclusion: the group was killed by an unknown compelling force. That phrase has haunted this case ever since. The group was led by Igor Dyatlov, a 23-year-old radio engineering student at the Ural Polytechnic Institute in Sverdlovsk. He was experienced. The people he had assembled were experienced. Between them, they had completed dozens of mountain routes at the highest difficulty rating available in the Soviet classification system. There were 10 of them when they set out on January 23, 1959. 9 would continue past the final resupply point. The 10th, Yuri Yudin, turned back on January 28th due to a leg injury. He was the only one who came home. Their destination was Mount Otorten, roughly 300 kilometers north of Sverdlovsk in the northern Urals. The route passed through territory that local Mansi people called Kholetshyakhl, a name that translates, depending on the source, as Dead Mountain or Mountain of the Dead. The group's own diaries make no mention of this. To them it was simply elevation 1079, a waypoint on a route they expected to complete in 16 days. The last diary entries were dated February 1st, a camp newsletter the group had been writing throughout the trip. They called it Evening Otorten, a joking reference to their destination, published its final edition that same night. After that, nothing. When the group failed to send a telegram from their endpoint on February 12th, family members and the sports club at the Institute began to worry. By February 20th, search parties were organized and dispatched by air into the search zone. On February 25th or 26th, accounts differ by 1 day. Searchers from the Slobtsov group crested the ridge and saw the tent. It was partially buried in snow, only the front section still visible above the surface. One side had been cut and torn open. They approached carefully. The tent was empty, but almost everything the group owned was still inside. 8 pairs of ski boots lined up along the edges, coats, warm jackets, the stove packed with firewood ready to be lit in the morning, provisions, personal diaries, cameras. Roughly 15 to 20 meters downhill from the tent, in the snow, footprints began. 8 or 9 sets of tracks moving together down the slope toward the tree line, approximately 1.5 kilometers below. The tracks showed people walking at a normal pace, not running. Some prints showed bare feet, others showed a single sock. One showed the outline of a soft boot on one foot and nothing on the other. The tracks disappeared into the deeper snow lower on the slope. Searchers followed the direction of the tracks to a large cedar tree at the edge of the forest. There they found the first 2 bodies, Yuri Doroshenko and Georgy Krivonishenko. Both were dressed only in underwear. A small fire had been made nearby. It had burned down into the snow and gone out. Branches had been broken from the cedar up to a height of 5 meters. The group had been climbing the tree, apparently to see the tent from below or to gather wood in the dark. 3 more bodies were found on the slope between the cedar and the tent over the following days. Igor Dyatlov himself was found 1.2 kilometers from the tent, partially on his back, one arm around the trunk of a small birch tree. His face had a frozen crust over it. He had been breathing into the snow before he died. Zenaida Kolmogorova was found 850 meters from the tent, face down. Rustem Slobodin was found between them, also with a frozen crust at his face, and, discovered only during autopsy, a hairline fracture in his skull. All 5 of these victims died of hypothermia. They had left the tent without adequate clothing, in temperatures estimated at minus 25 to minus 30 degrees Celsius, and they had not made it back. The remaining 4 members of the group were not found until May, when the spring melt exposed a ravine approximately 75 meters from the cedar. Under more than 2 meters of snow, searchers found a constructed platform, 14 small fir branches and 1 birch, arranged carefully on the ground as if to keep people off the cold snow. Nearby, in the ravine itself, they found the last 4, Lyudmila Dubanina, Semyon Zolotarev, Alexander Kolovatov, and Nikolai Thibault Brignol. These 4 had not died of hypothermia alone. The autopsy findings stopped the investigation in its tracks. Thibault Brignol had a massive, multi-fragment, depressed fracture of the skull, the kind of injury, the forensic examiner testified, that could not have been caused by a fall or a blow from a fist. It required force comparable to a high-speed vehicle impact or a blast pressure wave. He likely lost consciousness immediately and could not have moved on his own. Dubanina had bilateral rib fractures, multiple ribs broken on both sides of her chest simultaneously, along with massive internal hemorrhage. The examiner estimated she survived 10 to 20 minutes after the injury, possibly conscious throughout. Zolotarev had similar rib fractures on the right side with internal bleeding. And then the detail that no investigator has ever satisfactorily explained. Dubanina's tongue, the soft tissue of her lips, and her eyes were absent. The examiner attributed this to decomposition in the stream water. Some researchers have disputed this. The question has never been definitively settled. There was one additional finding. Small sections of clothing from 3 of the victims, tested at the request of investigator Lev Ivanov, showed elevated beta radiation readings. The examiner noted that the contamination appeared to be on the surface of the fabric, consistent with external contact rather than a neutron source. The radiological results were removed from the case file as, in the official notation, not relevant to the case. They do not appear in the final closing document. The case was officially closed on May 28, 1959. Cause of death, an unknown compelling force. No persons were named. No criminal charges were filed. The file was classified and sent to a restricted archive. It remained there for decades. So what happened on the night of February 1st to 2nd, 1959, on the slope of Dead Mountain? Researchers have proposed somewhere between 75 and 100 distinct theories over the decades. They fall into 3 broad categories: natural causes, the most widely accepted explanation within this category, and the one endorsed by the Russian General Prosecutor's Office following a review completed in 2020, is an avalanche, or more precisely, what Russian researchers call a snow slab. The argument runs as follows. When the group cut into the slope to level their tent platform, they destabilized a layer of compacted snow above them. During the night, that slab released, not a massive avalanche, but a dense, heavy block of snow, possibly weighing several tons, that came down onto the tent while the group was inside and asleep. The injuries to Dubanina, Zolotarev, and Thibault Brignol are explained in this framework by the crushing force of the snow slab against the rigid platform of skis on which the tent floor rested. The group cut their way out from the inside because the entrance was buried. They moved downhill because going back uphill to a collapsed tent in a blizzard was not survivable. They tried to build a fire and shelter. They failed. Mathematical modeling by researchers at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Lausanne, published in 2021, confirmed that a slab of sufficient size to cause the observed injuries could have formed on that slope under the recorded conditions. It is the closest thing to a scientific consensus the case has produced. But critics point to a problem. No searcher, including experienced alpinists, found any evidence of an avalanche or slab release at the site. The ski poles used to anchor the tent were still in place. The small items inside the tent were undisturbed, and experienced hikers retreating from an avalanche zone would have moved perpendicular to the slope, not directly downhill, back into the zone of danger. Search party member Sergei Sogrin, who was present at the site, stated flatly, "There was no avalanche catchment zone. Freshly fallen snow there is simply blown into the valley. There can be no question of any avalanche." The second category, criminal or military causes. Several theories in this category have been seriously examined. The most structurally coherent involves secret weapons testing. The northern Urals in 1959 were not far from active Soviet military and industrial facilities. Investigator Lev Ivanov himself, the man who officially closed the case, stated years later in an interview that he had been ordered to classify certain findings and to attribute the deaths to natural causes. He suggested that what he had found was consistent with a military or technological incident that the authorities did not want made public. The elevated radiation on the clothing, the catastrophic internal injuries with no external wounds, the classification of the file, the removal of the radiological results from the case record, the phrase unknown compelling force used in place of a specific mechanism. Individually, each of these details has an innocent explanation. Together, they form a pattern that a significant number of researchers find difficult to dismiss. The specific weapon most often proposed is a pressure wave device, a fuel-air explosive, or an early form of vacuum bomb, tested in the area that night. Such a device would produce the observed injuries without leaving conventional blast debris. It would explain the flight from the tent without full clothing, and it would explain why the Soviet state chose to seal the records rather than simply closing an accidental death case. Against this, former Russian military officials have stated on record that no rocket or missile trajectories from any test site in operation at the time passed over or near the Dyatlov Pass location. The physics of the proposed devices have also been questioned by several engineers who have reviewed the case. The third category, something that does not fit either framework. There is a small set of observed facts in this case that neither the avalanche theory nor the weapons theory explains cleanly. The group walked calmly down the slope. They did not scatter. They stayed together. They reached the tree, broke branches, built a fire. Some of them at some point cut clothing from the bodies of the two who died first at the cedar. The clothing of Krivonashenko and Doroshenko was found on the 4 victims discovered in the ravine. This means some members of the group were alive long enough to perform that action deliberately. And then they built a platform in the ravine out of branches. They arranged themselves on it. They died there. Whatever caused them to leave the tent, whether a snow impact, an external force, a sound, a light, a smell, something that has no name in the available evidence, they responded to it with remarkable coherence. These were not people in blind panic. They were people executing a survival plan that, for reasons we do not know, failed. The investigator who closed the case wrote that the group made 2 tactical errors: pitching the tent too late in the day and navigating 500 meters off course onto the wrong slope. Those errors put them in a position where, whatever happened next, they had very little margin. What happened next remains open. Igor Dyatlov was 23 years old. Zenaida Kolmogorova was 22. Lyudmila Dubinina was 20. The oldest member of the group, Semyon Zolotarev, was 38, a war veteran and experienced hiking instructor who had joined the group late, switching from another expedition to join Dyatlov's because the timeline was shorter. The pass near where they died was named after Igor Dyatlov in their memory. His name is on the maps now where there was no name before. Yuri Yudin, the 10th member, the one who turned back with a leg injury on January 28th, lived until 2013. He was the first person to identify the personal belongings recovered from the tent. He identified the bodies of Dyatlov and Slobodan. He spent the rest of his life reading everything written about the case. In one of his last interviews, he said he still did not know what happened to his friends. Neither do we. If you've followed this case, or if you have a theory you think holds up against the physical evidence, not the mythology, the actual evidence, leave it in the comments. I read them. This one, more than most, deserves a careful answer.